Hello, everyone, and good morning. Thanks for joining us today for another Sutta study. This morning, we have Bhante Suddhaso, who will be guiding us through Majjhima Nikaya 28, the Greater Discourse on the Simile of the Elephant's Footprint. So if you'd like to view the sutta and follow along, you can follow the link in the live chat. And if you have questions at any time, feel free to type them in, and Bhante will address them at the end of the talk. So good morning so far to Gita, Elaine, Michael, Poonam, and Jens. Elaine says, I found today's sutta easily on Sutta Central. Bhante Suddhaso read it last night. And if you'd like to follow along with Bhante Suddhaso's translation, you can use the one in the live chat. So at this time, we can turn things over to Bhante, who will lead us in some sutta study.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. Good morning, friends. So as mentioned, today we'll be looking at Majjhima Nikaya number 28, the Mahahati-Padopama Sutta, the Greater Discourse on the Simile of the Elephant's Footprint. So as usual, I'll read through the sutta and I'll periodically stop and give some explanations. Probably won't go through the whole sutta today, as the plan is to do this in two parts. So at some point I'll stop and switch to questions. Please feel free to enter questions at any time. It's better to ask your questions before I get to the end, to make sure that there's enough time to answer the questions. So the sutta begins. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the prosperous one was dwelling at Savatthi, at Jeta's Grove, in Anathapindika's park. So prosperous one, here's a translation of Bhagava. So Bhagava literally means one who has something valuable, which here it's translated as prosperous one. These days I've been leaning towards fortunate one as being a bit more literal of a translation. Prosperous one is also pretty good. And it says, there Venerable Sāriputta addressed the monks. Venerable monks. Venerable, those monks replied to Venerable Sāriputta. So this is a discourse given by Venerable Sāriputta, who was one of the Buddha's two chief disciples. The other one being Mahamoggallana. So Venerable Sāriputta was known for his precise, clear wisdom. And there's a number of suttas which are given by Sāriputta. So the majority of the suttas were delivered by the Buddha. The next most common speaker is Venerable Sāriputta. Venerable Sāriputta's suttas are known for being very analytical, logical, well-structured, so following clear frameworks and patterns. So Venerable Sāriputta said this, Venerables, just as the footprint of any jungle animal can fit inside an elephant's footprint, and the elephant's footprint is considered the best of them on account of its large size, in the same way, Venerables, all wholesome teachings are included in the Four Noble Truths. What for? The noble truth of unsatisfactoriness, the noble truth of the origin of unsatisfactoriness, the noble truth of the cessation of unsatisfactoriness, and the noble truth of the practice which leads to the cessation of unsatisfactoriness. So here, Sāriputta is introducing the simile of the elephant's footprint, which he did not invent. The Buddha came up with this. So if you look, there's another sutta, the lesser discourse on the simile of the elephant's footprint, which is based on the same simile, but giving a different application for it. But the same idea that the Four Noble Truths are encompassing all that is wholesome. They're encompassing everything within the domain of Buddhism. Everything within the domain of Buddhist practice is contained within the Four Noble Truths. So all of the Buddha's teachings fit within the Four Noble Truths. Which reminds me of a case where someone went to a monk in Tibetan Buddhist tradition and asked him, there's so many different schools of Buddhism. How can I know which ones are correct? And the monk replied, any school which teaches the Four Noble Truths and the Noble Eightfold Path is correct. So a very simple answer. So recently somebody asked, how can I tell what schools of Buddhism are good and which ones are bad? Like what sects are accurate and which ones are maybe flawed? Same basic answer. If it's based on the Four Noble Truths, the Noble Eightfold Path, then it's Buddhism. If it departs from or rewrites or alters the Four Noble Truths, Noble Eightfold Path, then it's not Buddhism. Something's wrong there. So the Four Noble Truths here, so the Noble Truth of Dukkha, which is translated here as unsatisfactoriness. So Dukkha literally means that which is hard to bear, that which is difficult to endure, that which is unpleasant to hold. So Dukkha is often translated as suffering, but it's important to be aware of the actual literal meaning of the word. Dukkha means that which is hard to hold, that which is difficult to endure. So that's everything, everything from extreme agony and torment on one end, all the way to that subtle, irritating feeling that something's not quite right. So all of that is dukkha, from one end to the other. So although it's a little clunky, I lean strongly towards the translation unsatisfactoriness, because that captures this whole span of meaning. So Sāriputta then goes into an explanation of the meaning of these Four Noble Truths, and he spends a great deal of time focusing on the first one. So he says, Venerables, what is the noble truth of unsatisfactoriness? Birth is unsatisfactory, decay is unsatisfactory, death is unsatisfactory. Sorrow, grief, pain, depression, and anguish are unsatisfactory. Not getting what one wants is unsatisfactory. Briefly, the 5 components subject to grasping are unsatisfactory. So here he's giving a stock definition of dukkha. So birth is dukkha. So we're born, which in the Buddhist explication of things, birth doesn't just mean emerging from a womb. That's one kind of birth. Birth is coming into a new state of existence. That's what birth is. So that may involve a womb, it may involve an egg, it may involve spontaneously popping out of thin air in the case of devas and beings in the lower realms. But it may also involve every single moment. Every moment, actually every morning when we wake up, that's like a moment of birth. Previously there was no consciousness, and then you open your eyes and it's like, oh, here I am again, coming into a new state of existence. And actually every single moment, it's like, oh, here I am. What is this? What's this state of existence? I have this memory of a few minutes ago of my state of existence involving eating yogurt and granola and little Italian cookies. But now the state of existence that I've been born into is me sitting in front of a camera talking about the suttas. So that's a very different state of existence. There's some similarities, but it's a distinctly different state of existence. So this also is what's meant by birth. Birth is coming into an experience of personal existence, an experience of individual existence. And briefly speaking, it sucks. It's uncomfortable. It's unpleasant. It's unsatisfying. The pervasive nature of an unenlightened being is it's uncomfortable. The basic character of an unenlightened being's experience is discomfort, displeasure, dissatisfaction. This pervasive feeling that something's wrong. So coming into any state of existence is automatically unpleasant because that state of existence is characterized by discontent, dissatisfaction, discomfort, displeasure. So birth is dukkha. Next it says decay. Decay is dukkha. And the Pali word here is jara. So jara means decay, decrepitude, the tendency of things to wither, to weaken, to worsen. So jara is often translated as aging or as old age, but that's not how the Buddha defined the word. When the Buddha defined jara, he defined it as your hair turning gray, your teeth breaking, your skin and bones getting fragile and frail, the weakening of all of your faculties and abilities, the diminishing of your mental sharpness and clarity. So he didn't define it just in terms of aging, but he defined it in terms of the weakening, the decay, the worsening of our condition. So you thought birth was bad. Well, it only goes downhill from there. It just keeps getting worse. So decay is dukkha. So the worsening of our condition, and this is something which is inevitable. It's inescapable. No matter how much we try to escape it or minimize it, it can't be escaped. Can put it off only for so long. And even when we're putting it off, we're actually not putting it off. We're just slowing it down a little bit. And so we're attached to our youth. We're attached to our health. We're attached to our abilities. We're attached to our capabilities. We're attached to what we think we're able to do. We're attached to what we think our body should be strong enough for. We're attached to what we think our mind should be able to do. For example, when I was young, I used to be really good at solving math problems in my head. I didn't need calculators. I didn't need paper. I didn't need notes. I could just look at a math problem and I'd be like, oh, okay, the answer is 48. Like I could just do it without any difficulty. Now I look at a math problem and I'm like, what? I don't get it. Like I need a calculator. Like I look at it and I'm just like, I can remember that 20 years ago, I would be able to figure this out in a finger snap. But now I look at it and it just looks like a bunch of meaningless words, meaningless letters, meaningless numbers. It doesn't have any, like there's this vague sense that there's something meaningful here, but I just can't do it anymore. So that's the decline of our mental faculties. And the problem is, of course, not the decline of the mental faculties. The problem is the attachment to the way our mental faculties used to be. Or I gave the example a few talks ago of my beautiful toenails and how magnificent and well-formed and shapely they are. And then the horrifying incident when I dropped a brick on one of my toes and it cracked my toenail all the way up to the root. And fortunately now, years and years and years later, it's almost healed. But for all those years, I had to deal with the fact that my toes didn't look the way that they were supposed to. One of them anyway, the other 9 were still perfect, still are perfect, in fact. But I had to come to grips with this fact that my attachment to having perfect toenails was causing me dukkha because, like everything else, toenails are subject to decay. I also have to deal with the fact now that one of my big toenails is discolored. It's very displeasing. Every time I look down, I'm just like, what is this? It's not supposed to be this way. But actually, it is supposed to be this way because the nature of bodies is that they decay. The nature of bodies is that they change, and that change is usually for the worst. It's usually not getting better. Not many people wake up in their 80s and say, I feel so much better than I did in my 20s. Doesn't usually happen that way. Usually it's like, oh, oh. Decay is dukkha. And finally, death is dukkha. And the Pali word here is marana, which is actually a present participle. So present participle is like English words that end in ing. So marana literally means dying. So it doesn't mean death, it means dying. And this I find interesting as well, because this is emphasizing not the moment of death, but rather the process of dying. So dying is not something that necessarily happens in a finger snap. It's something which can take minutes, hours, days, months, years. When one realizes that the body is sliding inevitably towards death, and throughout that process, we're faced with the fact that the body is slowly shutting down. The things which used to work are not working correctly anymore. And through that whole process, a lot of really horrible things start happening. Your kidneys start shutting down and your blood is filled with toxins. Your gallbladder stops working properly. Your stomach can no longer digest food the way it used to. It becomes difficult to breathe. You start to lose sensation in your fingers and toes. Like the death process, the dying process is not fun. It's dukkha. And it's unavoidable. If you've got a body, it's going to die. That's what bodies do. There's no body which lives forever. Bodies are born, they decay, and they die. That's the nature of bodies. So dying also, though, refers to the transfer from one state of being to another. So birth is arriving in a new state of existence, whereas death is the cessation of the current state of existence. And this also brings up a lot of dukkha, because death is the loss of something that we're deeply attached to. However much we dislike our existence, however painful and uncomfortable it is, the truth is that we're very attached to it. We're very much obsessed with it. And most people are also terrified of dramatic changes. They're terrified of plunging into the unknown. And this is what death represents. It represents a dramatic change and a plunge into the unknown. And this is very uncomfortable for most people. There's a small percentage of people who actually really love dramatic changes into new things, but they're not the majority by any means. So for most people, the prospect of the complete disappearance of the world that they know, the body that they know, the mind that they know, and plunging into a new world with a new body and a new mind, for most people, that's terrifying. It's not something that they face with joy or relish. But this is actually something that's happening in every moment. In every moment, our current moment is coming to an end. The life that we're living right now is ending. So every moment there's a moment of death, a moment of loss of this moment. Again, it can be a little easier to relate to this in terms of sleeping, once again. So many people are afraid of falling asleep. And that's because on some level, there's this knowing that falling asleep is like dying. That when you fall asleep, you have to let go of your world. You have to let go of your body. You have to let go of your mind. And that's just so difficult to face, so hard to bear. So dying is dukkha. And why is it dukkha? It's dukkha because we're clinging to our present experience. Decay is dukkha. Why is decay dukkha? Because we're clinging to our present experience. Are you starting to see the pattern here? And so he gives some other examples. Sorrow, grief, pain, depression, and anguish are dukkha. Well, what do sorrow, grief, pain, depression, and anguish come from? Clinging, attachment, desire. Ultimately, it comes from actually the next one, not getting what we want. So Who's to blame here once again? Who's to blame for all of our dukkha? Is it somebody else? Is it the universe that's to blame? Is it God that's to blame? Who's to blame? You. You are to blame for your own dukkha. Nobody else. Hashtag Buddhism. So, and finally he says, briefly, the 5 components subject to grasping are unsatisfactory. And this is usually the most cryptic of the statements, which is why Venerable Sāriputta then spends most of the rest of the sutta just explaining that one statement. Actually, I think the entire rest of the sutta is technically all about the 5 Kandas. Yeah, actually it is. So the entire rest of the sutta is just on this statement, the 5 components subject to grasping are unsatisfactory. So he says, Venerables, what are the 5 components subject to grasping? The body component subject to grasping, the feeling component subject to grasping, the identification component subject to grasping, the mental activity component subject to grasping, and the consciousness component subject to grasping. So these are what we call the 5 Kandas. So Kanda is translated here as component. So Kanda has a few meanings in Pali. One of its common meanings is tree trunk. So Kanda means tree trunk. Another meaning it has is a pile, a heap, so a pile of something. Another meaning it has is collection, so similar to the meaning of pile. It has a collection of things, a combination of things. So Kanda, here it's the 5 components of what we identify as me, the 5 components of personal existence. So the first one is the body, so the physical body, this experience of physical matter, which is subject to grasping, it's subject to clinging, to attachment, as I was mentioning earlier. We're attached to our body, we're attached to our strength, we're attached to our beauty, we're attached to our toenails, we're attached to our hair, or our lack of hair, as the case may be. So attachment to the body, and to what the body represents, which is the ability to interact with the physical world in order to get pleasant physical experiences. Next is feeling. So feeling is pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. So this basic reactive tendency we have of liking, disliking, and apathy. So pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral. This experience of things that we enjoy, things that we dislike, and things that we don't feel strongly about, which is clearly subject to grasping because we try to hold on to the pleasant things, push away the unpleasant things, and brush over the neutral things. The third one is translated here as identification. So the Pali word is sanya, which is commonly translated as perception or recognition, or occasionally as memory. So sanya is the mental process of labeling experiences, the mental process of deciding what it is that we're sensing. So for example, with sight, what's happening in each moment is that there's this uniform mass of light which just impacts the eyes. So there's no actual objects there, it's just a single field of light hitting the eye. But then we decide that, well, that region over there is a monk named Bhante Sumino. And that region over there is a fan. And that region over there is a stone wall. And that region over there is a carpet. So that's sanya. Sanya is the process of deciding that some part of the visual field is a monk and some part of the visual field is a carpet, and so on. In actuality, it's just a visual field, inseparable, indistinguishable. There's no distinct objects in there. But we project the idea, the appearance of individual objects, which mostly is based on memory and concept. Which is why sanya is sometimes translated as recognition. because it's based upon a memory of what we think a Buddhist monk looks like. And we're like, well, that region of visual information resembles my memories of Buddhist monks. So then that region is probably a Buddhist monk. So it's that pasting of a concept from a memory onto our experience. And part of what makes sanya particularly tricky is that we experience the world after it's been filtered through sanya. Unless you're very good at training your mind and identifying exactly what's going on moment by moment, most people are not living in the real world, so to speak, but they're living in the world of sanya. They're living in the world of conceptual appearances that they've projected onto the world. And for most people, these map up well enough that they can survive without getting hit by cars. Some people, it doesn't map up so well and they get hit by cars, or they wind up in mental institutions or living on the streets and so on. But most of us, it maps up well enough that we can squeeze by. We can muddle through somehow. But our function of sanya is actually quite unreliable. It's quite distorted. And it's also very much bound up in our sense of self. It's bound up in our sense of what's important. So we pay more attention to what we believe is important, less attention to what we believe is less important. We make a lot of effort to put identification onto things that we value, not so much onto things that we think are worth ignoring. Things that we've had a lot of experience with in the past, we build up a whole pattern of sanya around, a whole pattern of perceptions and concepts and identification patterns and so on. We build up around things that we've had a lot of experience with. Whereas when we experience something completely new, we don't have any of that. So we don't identify as much of anything. There was an interesting study that some anthropologists did there was a tribe that was living out in the middle of nowhere who had no contact with modern civilization. And at one point, airplanes started to fly over that region. So some anthropologists went there and just asked the tribal villagers, like, have you seen anything unusual in the sky lately? And a lot of the villagers just didn't seem to see anything at all. Some of them said, like, oh, there were some strange clouds recently, I guess. But the idea that there was a giant tube of metal, man-made metal with wings flying through the sky at hundreds of miles per hour, it just wasn't in their sanya. So they didn't see it. They didn't perceive the existence of a giant man-made bird flying through the sky. It just didn't happen. If they saw anything at all, it just looked like a weird cloud that was moving faster than usual. But like there was no sense of what it actually was because they had absolutely no memories or concepts to form a perception or an identification of that sensory experience. And there was also no sense that it was remotely important either. It had no relevance whatsoever to their life. No meaning to them at all. Therefore, there was no point in even trying to form a sanya around it. So this also is showing the function of sanya. And another major element to sanya is that it's usually distorted. So we believe that things are a certain way, so that's our experience. And this becomes a major issue when dealing with things like racial bias, or when dealing with personal opinions, or what's it called, confirmation bias, where you believe something is a certain way so that then that's how you see the world, even when the evidence is to the contrary. So sanya then can be quite problematic. A tremendous amount of delusion comes through and appears to us as actual reality. And that's because we're not aware of the functioning of sanya. So as one's practice develops, as one gets a better understanding of Buddhist concepts and trains oneself in mindfulness and samadhi and wisdom, then one can start to recognize the functioning of sanya. And more importantly, one can start to recognize the sensory experiences that happen before sanya gets in there and starts rewriting things. The next category here is mental activity, which is a translation of the word sankhara. So sankhara is one of these Pali words that has a broad range of meaning and is used in several distinctly different ways in different places. So in the context of the 5 Kandas, the 5 components of personal being, sankhara has the meaning of mental activities, mental programs, mental patterns, which includes thoughts and emotions. It includes tendencies. It includes impulses and urges. It's a very broad range of mental activities and objects. So it's sometimes translated simply as thoughts, but it has to be understood that it's not referring merely to full-formed verbal and visual thoughts, but it's also referring to mental activities, which can be much more subtle, can be much more difficult to pin down. And again, requires a great deal of precision of awareness and clarity in order to recognize them and identify them and start to do something about them. And the 5th one here is the consciousness component, which is vijnana in Pali. Vijnana is used in 2 main ways in the suttas, and there's some debate around this, but I'm in the there's 2 ways it's used camp. So one way is the sensory consciousnesses. So eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, and mind consciousness. So the 6 sensory consciousness, the 6 kinds of sensory consciousness. The other way it's used is referring to a more primordial awareness. And this is where there's debate among scholars as to whether or not that's a valid use of the word. I'm not going into that because it's not relevant to this sutta. In this sutta, consciousness seems to be used only in the sensory consciousness way. So briefly speaking, eye consciousness is the experience of a visual world. It's the experience, I am seeing all of those things over there. Or the auditory consciousness, I am hearing all of those sounds out there, etc. So it's then related to the sense of self for unenlightened beings anyway, which is where the grasping comes in. It's where the attachment comes in. I am seeing those things. I am hearing those things. I am aware of those mental objects. So it builds up that sense of self and other very clearly. Then after this, Venerable Sāriputta goes into an extended analysis of the 4 elements and then into consciousness. But I'd like to briefly check before I move on, are there any questions currently?
There are, actually.
So maybe I'll handle whatever questions there are, and then we'll go from there.
Sure. So good morning also to Liz, Edward, Sienna, as well as, I think I said Geeta already. And then Michael has a question. He says, don't we start to die as soon as we're born, just that we become aware of it later? For example, I was attached to my wonderful hair, but now I'd better get over that because there's far less hair to attach to.
Well, you have 2 options. Either shave your head or get some wigs. Then you don't need to worry about it anymore. I recommend the head shaving option. And in fact, if you're going with wigs, apparently it helps to shave your head there as well. I don't know. I've never worn a wig in my life, except for like a few seconds once, just for the fun of it. But yeah, do you start dying the moment you're born? That's one way to look at it. Yeah. technically we're always approaching death. So one of my favorite walking meditation instructions comes from Ajahn Brahm. And I especially love this because everyone thinks of Ajahn Brahm as like the loving kindness monk who's all happy and jolly and always talking about having a mind of loving kindness and practicing samadhi. But he gave these walking meditations instructions. He said, so as you put your right foot down, you think, I will die. As you put your left foot down, you think, that's for sure. So walking meditation, I will die. That's for sure. I will die. That's for sure. Another similar instruction, and I don't remember what teacher I heard this one from, is with every step you think, one step closer to death. One step closer to death. Of course, that you have to walk pretty slowly for that one. Yeah, because it's true. Every moment we're getting closer to death. Hashtag Buddhism. Hey, what can I say? It's the truth. It's the truth. Okay, next question.
Thank you. So Elaine asks, so we enter a new existence with a new mind. I thought the cultivated habits of mind and effects of past behavior were reborn after this body dies. Delusional me requires explanation, please.
Yeah, so the habits and patterns persist. So in that sense, you can say there's some carryover, but there's the arising of a new consciousness in each moment. So one way that I think about it is like you wake up in the morning and you go and you open your closet and there's all these clothes in there. And in the morning, the mind is foggy and hazy and our memories aren't terribly good. We open it and we're like, who bought all these weird tacky clothes? Well, I guess it's what I've got, so I'll just have to wear this stuff. And you put it on and then you walk out and slowly it dawns on you. It's like, oh yeah, I bought that stuff. Oh yeah, that was me. And this is the stories other people have told me. Even when I was a lay person, I wore very simple clothing. And as a monk, it's easy because I just wear the same thing every day anyway. Yeah, so there's, one comes into a new body and there's a discontinuity of consciousness, but there's still certain habits and tendencies which are present. So, for example, some people are born and they have this bizarre obsession with golf. And clearly they can't have gotten it from this life because golf is the most nightmarishly boring thing imaginable. So the only possible explanation is that they already built up a habit of golf from previous lives. There's no other way. I don't know why people keep laughing. I'm just talking about Buddhism, but the peanut gallery keeps laughing today. I don't know why. Yeah, so it's not accurate to say it's the same mind. There's actually a sutta which I'm planning to talk about one of these days, where it's actually built around exactly this point. A monk is holding the belief that this same consciousness continues from body to body, from life to life. And this gets to the Buddha, and the Buddha is like, no. And they're like, and he's like, call that monk to me. And the monk comes, and the Buddha's like, are you actually spreading this misinformation? And the monk's like, yeah, I am. And the Buddha's like, you misguided man, did I ever tell you such a thing? And the Buddha goes on to explain from there how it's not this same consciousness that goes from life to life, that it's a new consciousness arising in each life. But that consciousness is conditioned and influenced by what was done in previous lives. Okay?
Thank you. And Gita points out, this is a very large topic. Very true. So she asks, Bhante, are the 5 khandas also known as the 5 aggregates? That is form, feeling, perception, mental formation, and consciousness? Our retreat with Bhante Bodhi went over this in detail. And are the 5 aggregates also part of mentality and materiality? Namarupa, I guess.
Yeah, so aggregate is another translation of the word khanda. And it's a translation that I've never liked because I never in my entire life used the word aggregate for anything ever until I started learning Buddhism. And then they're like, the 5 aggregates. And I'm like, what the hell is an aggregate? And they're like, well, an aggregate is a component of your body and mind. And I'm like, then why didn't you just call it that? Like, why use this like bizarre word from like geology or construction or something? I don't even know. Like apparently something to do with cement. When do you use aggregate? Has to do with cement?
Road bases, the different components of the road base.
Yeah, so they used a word from road building in order to describe the components of body and mind. And it's like this weird, obscure word that nobody who isn't involved in road building even knows what it means, let alone uses. So I'm not a fan of the word aggregate. Apparently, if you're Italian, then the word aggregate is great, but I'm not Italian, so it's not great. I'm not having a great with the word Italian. Well, Italian is fine, but the word aggregate, I'm not having a great. So when I started doing my own translations, aggregate was one of the first words to get chucked in the rubbish bin. I was just like, no, I'm not using that one, definitely not. But yeah, to be honest, if you hear a Buddhist person use the word aggregate, they're probably not talking about roads. They're talking about the Kandas. What was the other question?
Is it part of mentality and materiality?
Yeah, so mentality and materiality is a somewhat clumsy translation of nama rupa. Nama rupa, I personally just translate as mind and body. So nama is the mind aspects of being, and rupa is the physical aspects of being. So that does map pretty well onto the 5 khandas. So rupa is rupa, and nama is the other 4. Yeah.
Which, and the other part of her question was, which makes it part of the 12 links of dependent origination?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then Elaine says, thanks, now I understand. Yen says, once a coworker was celebrating her birthday, she was saying she was born to live. I told her she was born to die. She didn't appreciate #Buddhism, but I thought I was being helpful.
So kudos to you, Jens. Bonus points, very clever. But yeah, I've had this experience a number of times where I just said like perfectly ordinary Buddhist things to non-Buddhist people, and they got like freaked out or offended. And I'm just like, I can remember one time I was talking with this person, a small business owner who had gotten like overly ambitious, and I think her business was failing because she'd been reaching farther than she was actually capable of doing. And she was like, maybe I was a bit delusional about what I was doing. And I'm like, yeah, it's true, you were delusional. And she got really offended, and I was just like, I mean, it's true, like you were delusional, and I mean, pretty much everyone is delusional, so what's the big deal? But for her, it was like this dire insult. I didn't mean anything by it. It's just like, we're all delusional. What's the big deal? Ayasoma is shaking her head. She was there when it happened. And afterwards, I was asking Ayasoma, I'm like, why did that lady get so upset? And Ayasoma was like, because you called her delusional. And I'm like, I'm a Buddhist teacher. I call people delusional 100 times a day. It's my job. It's what I do. But yeah, similarly, people like to pretend that they're not going to die. And they like to do anything they can to avoid thinking about death. Whereas in Buddhism, we actually actively think about death and talk about death all the time. So that can also cause a little bit of discomfort in people who aren't used to Buddhists. They're like, why are these Buddhists talking about death all the time? It makes them a little bit uncomfortable. So keep it up. In fact, next time you see your coworker, just be like, hello, good morning, how are you? You're gonna die.
No.
Death is coming.
Don't do it.
Just walk in and say, congratulations, another day closer to death. Ayasoma is saying, no, don't do this. Yeah. Another thing you can do on birthdays, by the way, is say, congratulations, 1 year closer to death. That's also a very Buddhist birthday greeting. But yeah, you do need to have some sensitivity around these things, because many people, that's not what they want to hear. Sometimes it's better to say things like, may you be happy. Yeah.
Better.
Sometimes it's better to practice loving kindness rather than the recollection of death. Okay.
And Jason says, hate types gonna be hate types.
It's true. It's true. What can I say? Yeah, hate types love reminding people that they're gonna die.
That was the final question so far. So if you would like to continue, or up to you.
It's actually getting close to 9, and the rest of the sutta actually kind of all fits together as one. So I think it's probably better to end there, and we'll do the rest of the sutta tomorrow.
All right. So thanks everyone for joining in. If there are any last minute questions about the topic so far, feel free to type them in. Otherwise, please join us tonight for a Dhamma talk by Ayasoma at 7:30 p.m. And then tomorrow morning for the continuation of this morning's sutta. And then monk chat tomorrow evening. And then this weekend, there's a lot going on. So you can find us at the Alms Round in West Orange, here at the monastery for outdoor meditation. And then on Sunday for our Buddha statue inauguration ceremony. So you can check our website for all those events and more. And we can end with 3 sadhus.
Sadhu, sadhu,
sadhu. And thanks everyone for joining in. Have a great